Welcome back to the Reidel Law Firm Library and Honesty channel. I know it's been a frantic couple weeks dealing with the Russia and Ukraine situation and sanctions coming down from that. It has been a busy time here for me, my colleagues, dealing with helping companies and even individuals and people involved with doing business in that part of the world and with folks in those either in those industries or those areas of the world. So I want to do a video. I know I've done some previously about what those Russia sanctions are, and they change. They're changing all the time. There's more guidance coming out. So every day that kind of understanding is getting a little better. I don't think I really need to rehash too much. What I might do is actually I'll post probably in the description an article. I need to post an article with kind of the Russia sanctions in a nutshell, describing them all and giving you guys some good resources, which I think will be helpful. But besides that, what I wanted to talk about today was when you're in a situation dealing with sanctions or potential sanctions, what do you do as a business owner, as somebody doing business across borders, or involved in a compliance department or a compliance official within a company? What do you do? What happens when you are in a situation where sanctions are coming, sanctions have already been levied or whatever, and it may affect your business? What do you do? So I want to talk a bit about that, and just got a couple points that I want to cover with everyone and just give you a primer, essentially, of what to do and when to do it, and of course reach out to us. So the first step is to stop. Don't complete any transaction that may be affected by sanctions or may be hit by some sanctions. Just don't complete the transaction. I know that's going to be very, very hard, and your sales professionals or even your boss, the business owner, it's going to be extremely difficult not to complete the transaction. And it's it's going to be really hard. But just the reason that I say that is because, first of all, U.S. sanctions law is strict liability. And what that means is if you break the law, if you complete that transaction which is sanctioned, even if you didn't have the intent to break the sanctions or you didn't know about the law, you will be punished under U.S. law. It's strict liability. It doesn't matter who you are, what your intent is, what happened. The law was broken, you must be punished, period. That's regardless of whether you're an old grandma that was sending money to a grandchild or whatever for college or something that's in a sanctioned country, or for whatever reason, or you're just trying to do business and it's someone you've been doing business with for 10 years. You trust them 100%, but oops, their name popped up on a sanctions list recently and you completed that transaction. You are now strictly liable, and the punishment can be severe, extremely severe. There are instances in the past where the BIS export control sanctions, BIS being one of the agencies, Bureau of Industry and Security, that does export control, the punishment put small businesses out. They put family businesses out of business for good. It's gone. And that is what could happen. The sanctions can just be enormous. They can be severe and devastating to your business. So don't do it. If you think it's sanctioned or you think it is, may be that transaction may be touched by an export control, don't do it. Just don't. Call me. Call Reidel Law Firm. So, and just a quick aside in regards to what may be sanctioned. Just understand that sanctions can hit. They can hit multiple things, but primarily they can hit persons. So that's legal persons and entities. So a company or an individual, they can be sanctioned. Industries can be sanctioned. That's called sectoral sanctions. That's what we started with in Russia several years ago. We sanctioned their energy industry. So you could not do business in certain aspects with their energy industry as a U.S. company. So industries, persons, entities, geography. So we might sanction an entire country itself or certain parts of a country. That's the case in Ukraine right now, where the United States, we being the United States, has sanctioned the self-declared republics, Luhansk and Donetsk, I think. I don't recall exactly what their formal names are, but those areas of Ukraine are sanctioned. So it's interesting that our sanctions on Russia also encompass parts of Ukraine. So again, geography, persons, entities, industries, all of those can be sanctioned, and just things to be aware of. If you feel like any aspect of your transaction could be sanctioned in regards to where your products are going, where they're coming from, who you're doing business with, or what companies you're doing business with, where the money is going through the banks, or what industries they're involved in, any of those could be red flags. Those are things you need to think about in regards to sanctions compliance. So after you've stopped and you did not complete the transaction, next step is to is to understand what sanctions may be applicable to you, your business, your industry, your products, your customers, your banks, your intermediaries, all of those. All of those are important parties or touch points for sanctions that could affect you. You need to, now, depending on what your role is in the company or what you're doing, it may not be your specific role to know all of that, but that is what we do at Reidel Law Firm. Call us. We will walk you through what sanctions may be applicable. We'll walk you through what sanctions are applicable to your specific customers or transactions or industry or area, geography, and we will help you adjust, right? We'll help you prepare to be in compliance with those sanctions, how to address them, how to continue doing business, hopefully, and find ways to stay compliant, stay out of trouble. So understand what those are. Now, the next step, and part of understanding as well, but I put it as a separate step, is to check for or audit, which would be kind of the synonymous in this step, third-party compliance measures. Now, third-party compliance measures means any of the third parties, being not you and not the counterparty, not your buyer, seller, whatever, whoever you're doing business with, but anyone else in the chain of the transaction who may be involved in also helping you screen for sanctions. This is going to be things like banks, brokers, your probably your freight forwarder or your shipping or your customs broker. All of those, there's a whole bunch of other, your rep or something, your in-country representative office or something. All of those will be third parties to the transaction or other parties, ancillary parties, whatever you want to call them. And they may have certain sanctions, rules that they have to follow. They may have certain sanctions procedures and policies that they follow. Find out what those are. See how it protects you. It probably won't cover you 100%, but knowing that you have some other items there to assist you is going to be helpful. So that's a good step to take. It's not strictly necessary for your own company within what you're doing and your own policies and procedures, but that's a step that I think a lot of people miss, and that I've seen clients forget about. Or on the other hand, if they forget about them, sometimes they rely on them 100%, and that's another wrong thing to do. Is don't forget about them, and then don't just expect that your bank or your freight forwarder or your customs broker is going to do all the sanction screening for you. Because if they miss something, you are liable. It's strict liability. So don't forget it. Don't over rely on it, but understand what it is, know what's happening there, so that you can also build your own compliance program and take it from there. And that's the third step, really, is start building a compliance program and procedures. Now, I could talk all day about this, and there's entire books written on the subject, but really I want to boil it down to a few key bullet points, and primarily it being, so understand your internal risk management. So understand what is the risk appetite that you have as a company or an individual doing business across borders or business in certain parts of the world. How much risk are you willing to take for how much reward? Obviously, that's a business decision. And commensurate with that risk, with understanding what risk you may be undertaking, you need to then base your internal risk management on what do we do to help minimize that risk? What policies and procedures do we put in place to make sure that our risk appetite that our risk does not overtake our appetite, right? That we don't bite off too much. We don't have too much to chew on, in a sense. So that's the first one, is internal risk management, thinking about how much risk you want to take on, what steps you can take to mitigate that risk. That's a whole department in of itself in a lot of companies these days. But once you understand that, once you have a guideline for the risk you want to take, how you can mitigate those risks, then you need to understand the compliance procedures, right? And develop compliance procedures. So this would involve figuring out what sanctions may be applicable, how you're going to check those sanctions lists or those sanctions regulations, or export controls regulations. Doesn't have to be sanctions necessarily, but export control regulations or import control regulations, all sorts of stuff. How are you going to check on those? How are you going to understand them and apply them to your transactions? It's great that you know it, but if you don't know it and apply it to your transactions, you might as well not have a program, right? So you got to go that extra step, know it, apply it to your transactions, and take it to that next level and stay compliant. So, and then lastly, within building a compliance program, I have is transaction procedures and training. So once you've developed this program, you've done your risk analysis, you have great procedures in place, you've taught someone to recognize it and implement it in your transactions. Now you need to empower the people in your company or in your department or whatever to be able to red flag and recognize these issues and take steps to protect your company. And what that entails is basically training people to recognize, hey, if we're doing business with a Russian national, even if they're based in Cyprus or whatever, maybe we need to have a second eye on this and just make sure it's compliant. Or maybe we're doing business in the Middle East in the defense industry, and we need to make sure that proper export controls are met. What do? We need to pass it off to the compliance folks or the next level, or your attorney, right, a law firm, right, to finish that transaction and do business. So transaction procedures and training, very important. So moving on from building the compliance program, the next big step is going to be keeping up with ongoing compliance matters. This one it's kind of self-explanatory. It's not anything, I think that's anything special, but basically keeping your lists up to date. So you have sanctions lists, you have blocked lists or unverified lists here in the U.S. for identifying either blocked parties or parties who may be blocked or we don't know enough information about, and you better be careful dealing with them. We have lists for that, and they're updated all the time. I mean, every week almost I get a notice from OFAC or BIS or whomever updating their list. And you need to keep your lists up to date. So if you have a third-party provider like software for screening that, hopefully they're going to be up to date as well. Talk to them about that. But keeping your lists up to date, staying abreast of new sanctions and new regulations. Guidance is coming out all the time. Obviously, if you've seen in the Russia-Ukraine situation, that sanctions come immediately and take immediate effect. And you need to figure out, and you maybe have to read a couple hundred pages of sanctions regulatory rules or guidance to figure out what's happening and what you need to do, but you got to do it ASAP. It's time is of the essence. I mean, there were plenty of sleepless nights for myself and other compliance professionals in February and March of 2022 here dealing with the Russia-Ukraine issues. So you got to do it. You got to do it. You just got to know. You got to stay abreast of it and stay compliant. Adjust your program and your plans accordingly. And then lastly, I made these just two bullet points, and I'm gonna roll them together. Keeping good records and performing audits, right? So keeping good records, it's gonna help you. It's only gonna help you, right, in identifying any errors, identifying gaps, and putting better procedures in place to improve your compliance. It's a good thing, and usually by law you have to keep records to some extent, depending on what you're doing exactly and what industry and business you're in. So keeping good records is very important, and that can mean a lot of things, whether it's a hard drive or a cloud with all of that, or paper in a locked cabinet or something. All sorts of ways to handle record keeping. The next one is the audit. So some industries like financial institutions, money service businesses, and related types of industries will be required to do either annual or sometimes every 2 years biannual audits of their compliance programs and of their compliance systems and testing those. Usually it's not required for most small businesses or just companies doing international trade, but it is an important aspect for you to think about. Obviously you don't need to do it every year, probably, depending on what you are doing and how much money is crossing borders and whatnot. But it's a good idea every couple of years or every few years to do an audit, look over with the compliance professional what you've done, how your procedures are, what your compliance program looks like, to fill any gaps, to make sure it's adequate, to keep you out of trouble. Again, all of this is preventative, and you may not ever get in trouble, but if you do get in trouble and the steps are not there and you haven't done everything you're supposed to, the consequences can be catastrophic. So it's very, very important for you to just take that time and be serious about it and make sure that you maintain compliance and take steps to meet the requirements there. So lastly, I want to round out, so what do you do in regards to if you're already in the middle of transactions and whatnot? What you need to do, first thing, is look for, if there are sanctions that was just passed, look for any exceptions to that sanction or any licenses that may be available. So exceptions being that certain types of categories of goods maybe or transactions are carved out of the sanctions. Or on the other hand, if you are covered by those sanctions, maybe there is a license available, whether that's a general or specific, ideally general, but maybe they give you a license that you can conduct those transactions. An example recently being so sanctions against Russia, but in particular the sanctions against Ukraine, against the Ukrainian self-declared republics. There is a sanction against U.S. persons and companies and people doing business and sending money to individuals within those republics. Now, there is a general license available for personal remittances. So if you have family there or I think even maybe a business there, you can remit money to keep that business open or to keep your family fed, things like that. You can send money under that general license. Interestingly, I think charities is not covered by a general license. So you can't give money to a charity to go to those self-declared republics, but you can send money personally to individuals there. So there's little quirks like that. There's general licenses available. So just because you see the news come out that your product or your industry is sanctioned, don't stop there, right? There's a deeper analysis to be done. That's what attorneys do. That's what compliance professionals do. So give us a call, talk to somebody, figure those out. Now the next one is worst case scenario. You end up in a situation where there are sanctions on you and your transactions, and it's the end of the road. There's no licenses. There's nothing available. What do you do, right? Well, how I counsel my clients is I tell them, well, let's look at the terms of your contract here or the transaction. Let's figure out what is happening, what terms are in the contract that we need to abide by or that we have to break, unfortunately, and then look at key things like force majeure, termination, things like that, impossibility, looking at those terms to see what contractually we can rely upon to exit that transaction and end that contract or do whatever we need to do to maintain compliance. And then lastly, there usually is a wind down period, as typically how it's called, a wind down period for sanctions or for certain transactions. And that will be provided in the sanctions regulation itself. It'll say, look, if you're doing this type of transaction, this business, you have 30 days or 45 days or sometimes more, 100 days, 120 days to wind down your business and your transactions and to exit from that sanctioned activity. So look for things like that as well. That one's kind of hit or miss. It really depends on the situation and what's going on in the world and how the U.S. views their sanctions regime in that instance. That's really it in a nutshell. Take all of those steps. We'll just recap real quick. Stop, don't do the transaction. Understand what your sanctions, understand what sanctions may be applicable. Call a sanctions professional, Reidel law firm. Check for third-party audit compliance and start building a compliance program. Keeping up with ongoing compliance, it's always a huge one there. And then figuring out how to exit your transaction or your contract. All of those are the major steps that I'm counseling clients on and dealing with sanctions. Now, obviously, your specific situation is going to be unique. None of these are the same. So it's really, even though I can give you some guidelines and some bullet points, every situation is going to be a little bit different and unique, and how we approach it is going to be different. So I can't give you custom steps here, because it may not be the best for you. It may get you in trouble. So give us a call. Let's chat about what business you're doing and what sanctions may be applicable and how we can help keep you out of trouble and keep you compliant. There'll be details in the description on how to reach out to us and find our website. So thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.